It started with a weak, almost inaudible signal, barely a whisper, like static from an old radio. It was dismissed as insignificant, even laughable. The engineers, experts in their fields, exchanged smirks as they glanced at the screen. "Another false alarm," one of them muttered. The others nodded, some barely glancing at the monitor before returning to their work. After all, they'd seen this before. The occasional flicker, the occasional glitch. It never led to anything substantial. What could it possibly mean? But what if they had listened? What if that faint signal had been the one thing standing between them and a catastrophe? Instead, they mocked it, brushing it off as just another fluke in the system, a weak signal that couldn't possibly be the last chance for survival. In that room, surrounded by massive machinery and the hum of industrial systems, the idea of danger seemed remote. The facility was a fortress of precision, designed to withstand pressure, heat, and the high forces of industry. How could something as small as a signal even pose a threat? It was this very arrogance, this overconfidence in their environment, that led to their downfall. The facility had been running for years, its systems tested time and time again, but as the signal pulsed weakly on the screen, it was nothing more than an inconvenience to the workers. They were too accustomed to the noise of the factory, to the constant hum and buzz of equipment. They had become numb to the occasional glitches that came with operating such a massive system. Little did they know that weak signal was a harbinger of disaster, the first sign of an impending crisis that, if addressed, could have been averted. But it wasn't, and in the coming moments, the entire facility would pay the price. If you're enjoying this video so far, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what you think caused this industrial disaster. Also, if you want to keep learning about these tragic events, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Now let's dive deeper into the next part of this story. To understand the magnitude of the disaster that was about to unfold, it's crucial to know more about the facility itself. This wasn't just any industrial plant. It was a powerhouse of production, a place where precision, efficiency, and immense power came together to create products that powered entire industries. Machines whirred and buzzed at an almost deafening volume, operating at full capacity. Engineers, workers, and technicians moved methodically, overseeing a complex web of equipment that seemed invincible. This was a place that had been optimized for success, a place where safety protocols were in place and routine checks were made daily. The facility's operations were so finely tuned that even the slightest malfunction could have serious consequences. Yet, everything appeared to be running smoothly on that fateful day. The workers had grown, accustomed to their environment, confident that their systems and training would prevent any catastrophic failures. After all, this plant had seen its share of tests and survived them all. It was designed to endure, built to handle extreme pressure, extreme temperatures, and the heavy demands of the production cycle. The machines were, in a sense, the heart and soul of the plant. Massive furnaces, towering conveyor belts, intricate mechanical arms, everything worked in concert. A failure in any single part of this system could spell disaster. Yet, in the eyes of many, the most critical aspect of the operation was the monitoring system. The alarms, the sensors, the signals that could indicate potential problems. These systems were the plant's early warning system, a safeguard against the worst-case scenarios. But what happened when these signals, which were supposed to be trusted, were dismissed as irrelevant? That weak signal on the screen wasn't just a glitch. It was part of a much larger system designed to detect and prevent the exact kind of disaster that was about to unfold. The failure to pay attention to it wasn't just an oversight. It was the product of a deep-rooted belief that the facility could handle anything, and that belief would soon prove fatal. As the weak signal blinked, unnoticed by many, the danger was already beginning to rise. And though the workers were oblivious, the plant was entering its most dangerous phase yet. The warning signs, like many, before, would be ignored, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The warning signal was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not specifically looking for it. It wasn't loud, nor did it trigger an immediate alarm. It was just a faint flicker on a digital monitor, a slight variation in the usual flow of data. To the untrained eye, it looked like just another anomaly. One of those things that happen from time to time, like a small fluctuation in pressure or a minor glitch in the system. No big deal. But for the few who were trained to notice such things, that small anomaly was a glaring warning. The signal was weak, yes, but it was still there, and that in itself was alarming. It was telling them something was wrong. Perhaps something very wrong. A small change in the pressure system, an offbeat signal from the sensors, a distortion in the electrical output. Whatever it was, it signaled an issue that needed immediate attention. The workers, however, weren't interested in investigating it further. Their mindset was simple. They had seen it all before. Small glitches like these had come and gone without ever amounting to anything. They had become desensitized to the constant barrage of alerts and signals, many of which turned out to be false alarms or temporary fluctuations in the system. This time, however, was different. The signal was indicative of an issue in the plant's most critical system, the containment system, which was responsible for regulating pressure, temperature, and flow within the factory's most volatile machinery. A disruption in this system meant disaster, but, as the workers continued their routine, the weak signal was drowned out by the noise of the machines, ignored in favor of maintaining the daily operations. It wasn't just the complacency of the workers that led to this oversight. It was the culture of the plant, a culture that valued speed, efficiency, and production over caution and vigilance. Everyone was focused on meeting quotas, pushing through the daily grind, and finishing the tasks on time. Safety checks, while present, were often treated as formalities rather than absolute necessities. The focus was always on moving forward, on getting things done, and the potential risks were treated as a secondary concern. The result? The weak signal remained a background noise, something that seemed irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. But it wasn't irrelevant. It was a sign of an impending disaster, and the clock was ticking. The longer the workers ignored it, the closer the explosion would become. As the day went on, the initial indifference to the weak signal began to turn into an undercurrent of unease, although it was still largely ignored. The machines continued to hum, the workers continued their tasks, and the normal rhythm of the plant pressed on. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. That faint signal, which had once seemed so insignificant, was the first ripple in a growing storm. The system was beginning to show cracks, and they were getting wider by the minute. It wasn't just the signal anymore. Small irregularities began to emerge across the plant. A pressure gauge that read slightly higher than normal. A fluctuating temperature control that couldn't quite stabilize. The sound of the machinery, once constant and steady, started to take on a strange, unpredictable quality, almost as if it were growing more erratic by the second. Some workers, who had been paying a little more attention, could feel it too. A sense of something being off, a subtle change in the air. The atmosphere in the facility was no longer just the hum of industry. It had shifted into something more tense, more brittle. Still, there were no alarms, no loud warnings, nothing to indicate that this was anything more than an inconvenience. Yet for a few of the more experienced workers, this mounting tension was impossible to ignore. They knew the facility inside and out, and they knew that sometimes the smallest signs, a faint signal, a slight pressure difference, could snowball into something far worse. But these workers were a minority, and their concerns were not shared by the majority. The higher-ups, those responsible for overseeing safety protocols, were confident that everything was fine. "It's just a glitch," one of them said dismissively, when approached by an employee about the increasing number of irregularities. The system's been running for years without issue. It's probably just some minor data noise. Keep working. But for those with the experience to recognize the signs, there was a growing realization that something much more dangerous was unfolding. The weak signal that had initially been brushed off was a mere prelude to something far more destructive. Pressure was building, and it was only a matter of time before the system could no longer contain it. Still, the clock was ticking. The workers pressed on, their focus diverted by the immediacy of the work. Their minds were preoccupied with the tasks at hand, their sense of urgency driving them to overlook the potential danger just beneath the surface. The mounting tension in the air was palpable, yet still, it remained unspoken. Everyone just carried on, blissfully unaware of how close they were to the breaking point. As the irregularities continued to mount, the faint signal now seemed like the first warning in a series of cascading failures. Yet, despite the mounting, evidence that something was going wrong, the response from the team remained insufficient. Workers continued their tasks as usual, ignoring the mounting tension in the air. Even when the signs became impossible to deny, there was still no immediate action. The system was showing cracks, but the cracks were being met with complacency rather than urgency. In hindsight, it became clear that the response, or rather, the lack of it, was the critical turning point in the story. By the time the first serious signs of trouble were evident, it was already too late. The plant's leadership had brushed off the minor glitches as routine, the kind of thing that happened in any high-demand industrial environment. The equipment had always worked fine before. The system had never failed. Why should they worry now? The crucial moment came when a more senior engineer, sensing the growing tension, called for a diagnostic check to assess the integrity of the facility's pressure containment systems. But even then, the response was far too slow. The request was dismissed as an unnecessary overreaction. "It's nothing more than a minor fluctuation in the data," one supervisor said. "We'll get around to it after lunch." But that was the moment when everything changed. The slight malfunction had been ignored once, and then again, until the system finally reached its breaking point. The plant was operating under the assumption that things were still normal, that the previous alarms had been false, and that any further checks were unnecessary. When the explosion finally came, it wasn't a surprise to those who had been paying attention to the signs. But it was an explosion of magnitude and fury that could have been prevented with a response as simple as taking a few minutes to assess the data, make a small adjustment, and put safety procedures into action. But instead of swift action, there was hesitation. Instead of listening to the faint signal, the workers carried on. The signal was right, but they were wrong. As the seconds ticked away, the plant's failure to respond turned from a missed opportunity to a catastrophic oversight. By the time the engineers had finally been called in to examine the machinery, the explosion was imminent. It wasn't a question of if anymore, but when. The clock was running out, and the failure to act had ensured that the plant was about to pay a very steep price. It happened without warning, but in hindsight, it was almost inevitable. The explosion wasn't just the result of one single malfunction. It was the culmination of a series of ignored signals, overlooked warnings, and failed responses. The building shook as the sound of the blast reverberated through the walls. A thunderous roar filled the air, followed by a deafening silence, and then chaos. The plant, once a symbol of industrial might and precision, was now an inferno, consumed by the very forces it had been built to contain. In an instant, the systems that had once controlled the pressures, the temperatures, and the flow of dangerous chemicals within the factory turned against the workers. The explosion sent shockwaves through the building, followed by a rush of fire and debris. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke engulfed everything in its path. Machinery, once pristine and operational, was now twisted metal, unrecognizable in the aftermath of the blast. Workers who had been at the heart of the facility, moving from station to station, suddenly found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The blast had torn through the plant, breaking apart critical infrastructure and tearing through the walls of the control rooms. Those who were fortunate enough to survive the initial explosion found themselves stumbling through a haze of smoke, fire, and falling debris. The facility, once a place of routine, had transformed into a war zone. As the fire spread, the damage was evident. There were casualties, some of them unaccounted. 4. Some workers were still missing in the chaos, unable to escape the destruction fast enough. The emergency alarms that had once been ignored now blared urgently, but it was too little, too late. The plant's emergency protocols, which had been designed to safeguard against such a catastrophe, had failed to respond in time. The damage was irreversible, and the consequences of ignoring the weak signal had become painfully clear. In the aftermath, there would be investigations. There would be reports, finger-pointing, and blame placed at the feet of those who failed to act in time. But the destruction had already been done. The cost of complacency, the failure to respond to a weak signal when it was first noticed, was far too high. As the fire burned and the plant was reduced to smoldering rubble, the magnitude of the disaster began to sink in. It wasn't just the physical damage that was overwhelming. It was the realization that the warning signs had been ignored. It wasn't just a breakdown of machinery. It was a breakdown of the very system that was supposed to protect the workers. And in the end, the most tragic part was that this disaster could have been prevented if the signal had been taken seriously from the beginning. The destruction was almost too much to comprehend in the moments immediately following the explosion. The once bustling plant had now become a chaotic scene of devastation, smoke, and fire. The screams of the injured, the sound of collapsing structures, and the crackling of flames filled the air. The facility, known for its sheer size and strength, was now nothing more than a fractured skeleton of its former self. Yet, the real work had just begun. As the dust settled, a sense of urgency took over. The first responders, fire crews, and emergency personnel rushed to the site, working tirelessly to contain the flames and rescue those trapped in the rubble. There were few survivors, and the ones who made it out had little more than their lives. The damage was devastating, and the human cost of the explosion was still unclear. But what was certain was that lives had been lost, and many more were forever changed. In the aftermath, investigators arrived at the scene trying to piece together what had gone wrong. As they sifted through the charred remains of the plant, they began to uncover the evidence of a catastrophic failure. The signal, the weak, dismissed signal that had first alerted the workers to the danger, was now a focal point of the investigation. How had such a simple, seemingly inconsequential warning been ignored? And why had the response to the growing signs of trouble been so delayed? The investigation revealed a pattern of complacency and overconfidence. The plant's leadership had failed to act on the warning signs. The weak signal that had first been dismissed was, in fact, a crucial indicator of an impending disaster. It wasn't just one small failure that led to the explosion, but a series of missteps, ignored alerts, neglected safety checks, and a general attitude of, "It'll never happen here." Workers, too, had grown complacent, trusting in the system and in the assumption that everything was running as it always had. It wasn't just a single error, it was a culture of negligence. The failure to recognize the importance of monitoring systems, the refusal to treat minor glitches with the seriousness they deserved, and the overconfidence in the safety protocols all combined to create a perfect storm of disaster. Had the signals been taken seriously, the explosion could have been prevented, or at least minimized. Instead, the response was one of disregard, a deadly mistake that cost lives and destroyed the plant. In the weeks and months that followed, the investigation continued. Experts were brought in, reports were written, and recommendations were made. But for the families of the victims, for the workers who survived, and for the people whose lives were forever changed by the explosion, the investigation was little comfort. The real lesson, the one they wished they had learned earlier, was that no signal, no matter how small or faint, should ever be dismissed. Not when lives are at stake. The explosion had left the facility in ruins, but more than just physical damage, it left behind a deeper scar. One that was harder to mend, the lost opportunities to prevent the disaster. In the wake of the devastation, the world watched as the plant's leadership and the broader industry scrambled to learn from their mistakes. But the most painful realization was that many of the lessons they learned had been available all along. Only they hadn't been heeded. One of the most glaring missed opportunities was the failure to take preventative measures seriously. The weak signal, which had been dismissed as a trivial glitch, was not the first time that small signs of malfunction had been ignored in the name of productivity. It was a symptom of a much larger issue within the culture of the facility. Efficiency, meeting quotas, and keeping the machines running were always the top priorities, often at the expense of safety. Time and time again, safety protocols were treated as secondary concerns, mere formalities, rather than the critical components they should have been. Had there been a greater emphasis on safety, had workers and management been more diligent about recognizing and responding to warning signs, the outcome could have been drastically different. Simple actions, like pausing for a thorough inspection when an anomaly appeared, or implementing a more robust safety system that demanded immediate attention for any discrepancies, could have saved lives and prevented the disaster. But these were actions that were never taken, and the consequences were dire. Furthermore, the complacency that had set in within the workforce was another missed opportunity to prevent the disaster. Over time, the workers had grown too accustomed to the sounds of the machines, the hum of the facility's operations. It had become routine, and with routine came a sense of invincibility. They had operated within the facility for so long without any major incidents that they had stopped looking for the warning signs, stopped questioning the system. It was only when the explosion occurred that the workers realized how fragile the system truly was. The missed opportunities didn't end with the workers. The plant's leadership had also failed in their role. The decision to dismiss the signal as a minor glitch without further investigation reflected a failure of leadership. The leadership's reluctance to consider the possibility of a larger issue, the reluctance to halt production and examine the facility, was rooted in a mindset that prioritized keeping operations running over ensuring the safety of the workers and the integrity of the plant. In the end, this mindset was what led to the catastrophic failure. The lessons learned in the aftermath were critical, but they came at a heavy price. Every missed opportunity, every decision to ignore a warning sign, had contributed to the eventual explosion. And though the industry would go on to implement new safety protocols, those who were affected by the disaster, the survivors, the families of the victims, would never forget that the solution to the problem had been right in front of them all along. It was just a matter of taking the small signals seriously. The explosion, though devastating for the facility and its workers, set off a chain reaction across the industry that would reshape the way companies approached safety and crisis management for decades to come. The ripple effects were felt not just within the company, but throughout the entire industrial sector, as safety protocols and systems were re-evaluated and revised in the wake of such a preventable tragedy. In the months following the explosion, industrial leaders from across the country gathered to discuss what went wrong, how it could have been avoided, and what steps should be taken to ensure it never happened again. The disaster had forced the industry to confront the harsh reality that even the most advanced machinery, the most sophisticated systems, and the most experienced workers were vulnerable if they were not properly monitored, analyzed, and maintained. The weak signal that had once been dismissed as a mere glitch was now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The oversight, the negligence, and the misplaced confidence in a system that had, for too long, been assumed to be flawless. One of the major changes that followed the explosion was the establishment of more stringent safety protocols. New regulations were put in place demanding that any unusual signals or discrepancies no matter how small, be investigated immediately. Companies were now required to have dedicated teams for regular inspections, and safety alarms were upgraded to ensure that no warning went unnoticed. The explosion had underscored the importance of taking every signal seriously, no matter how minor it seemed. Industry leaders now recognized that a weak signal, if ignored, could quickly escalate into a catastrophic failure. The disaster also highlighted the need for better communication between workers, management, and engineers. In the past, workers had been encouraged to focus on efficiency and meeting production goals, sometimes at the expense of safety. But the explosion demonstrated that safety and productivity were not mutually exclusive. In fact, a focus on safety was a key driver of long-term efficiency and success. Companies started to invest more heavily in training programs that emphasized the importance of proactive communication, encouraging workers at every level to speak up when something didn't seem right. Beyond safety protocols and communication, the explosion also shifted the way companies thought about risk management. The days of assuming that it couldn't happen here, were over. Companies now understood that risks existed even in the most routine operations. Risk assessments became more comprehensive, and crisis management plans were developed for a wide variety of possible disasters, including industrial accidents like explosions, fires, and equipment failures. Companies that once focused solely on operational efficiency now began to put as much energy into building resilient systems that could withstand potential crises. But while these changes marked significant progress, the industry was forever scarred by the realization that this disaster, which could have been prevented, had exposed the vulnerability of an entire sector. No amount of safety protocol or advanced technology could fully shield workers and companies from the dangers of complacency and overconfidence. The industry's transformation was born from tragedy, and though it would ultimately lead to safer practices and more responsible approaches to industrial operations, the memory of the explosion would always linger. As the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the industry began to realize the profound impact of the disaster. It wasn't just a momentary tragedy, it was a wake-up call for every company, every worker, and every leader in the field of industrial operations. The explosion may have been the result of a single moment of neglect, but the lessons learned from that disaster would resonate for generations to come. The weak signal that was once laughed off was now a poignant reminder of the importance of vigilance, caution, and the need to treat every warning as potentially life-saving. For the workers who survived, for the families of those who perished, and for the industry as a whole, the explosion was more than just an event. It was a turning point. It showed that no matter how advanced the technology, no matter how seasoned the workers, the cost of ignoring the smallest signs of trouble could be catastrophic. Now, with new safety protocols in place, the question remains, will the industry truly change? Will future workers and leaders be able to learn from the mistakes made, or will they fall into the same trap of complacency? The explosion, although tragic, provided an opportunity for reflection and growth. It offered a chance to reassess priorities and to build a system that would not only meet production goals, but also safeguard the lives of those responsible for making them happen. But this change didn't happen automatically. It took time, effort, and, most importantly, a collective recognition that safety should never be compromised. As we reflect on the events that led to this disaster, we must ask ourselves, are we truly paying attention to the signals around us? In our own lives, whether at work or in our personal worlds, how often do we overlook the small signs that could be the difference between safety and disaster? For those who survived, the memory of the explosion is a reminder to never underestimate the power of a seemingly weak signal. It's a reminder that every warning should be taken seriously, no matter how insignificant it may seem at the time. If you found this story as impactful as we did, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how small signals can prevent major disasters. Don't forget to hit the like button to help us share more untold stories. and subscribe to the channel for more insights into industrial safety and real-life lessons from history. Thank you for watching, and we hope this story has helped you see the importance of vigilance, no matter how small the warning may seem.